Okay, so this evening we have Dr. Andy Pershing from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and he's going to share his vast knowledge of climate change and how it's affecting the Gulf of Maine. So Andy, take it away.
All right. So what I'm going to do with this evening, I tried to think about my talk in a little bit of a different way for this audience, especially because it's a Maine audience. I really wanted to give you a sense for what some of the patterns we're seeing in Maine and in the Gulf of Maine in particular, and why they're important, and also why Maine is a really important leader, I think, right now in among the states that are trying to take action to address climate change. So I'm going to talk very briefly with an introduction about the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I'm going to talk, kind of ground my talk in some results from the National Climate Assessment that came out a couple of years ago. And then I'm going to talk very briefly at the end about the work of the Maine Climate Council. So the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, we are located in downtown Portland, right by Becky's Diner on Commercial Street, and we pioneer collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And we do that with our three core program areas. So I get to lead our science program, and the mission of our science program is to increase our understanding of the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. One of the things that we try to do with our science program is to try to get this balance between doing work that is interesting and important and relevant locally. So this is my colleague Lisa Kerr, who's an expert on fish ecology and on fish modeling. But she also spends a lot of her time working with the fishery management councils and fishery management agencies, both here in New England and some internationally, to try to bring that knowledge to help make fishery management sustainable. But we also try to do work that is interesting in a scientific sense, in that it can be generalized from the Gulf of Maine, so that what we're learning in the Gulf of Maine actually benefits the broader community of people interested in the ocean. Our community program is one of our other three programs. They do work with people, and specifically they do a lot of work with marine stakeholders, with the fishing industry, with the seafood supply chain. Here is Adam Bacchus, who's one of our community program managers, explaining how a trawl net works to a group of people from the restaurant community in Portland. This is a program we have called Trawl to Table that tries to increase the ability of people in restaurants to be able to talk about seafood and to understand more where seafood actually comes from. And then probably what we're best known for here in the state is our work with 5th and 6th graders. We have a program called Lab Venture, where when we're not in a pandemic time, we bring 10,000 kids in the state to GMRI without any cost to them or their parents. So we provide that to their students all throughout the state. So we've now, I believe, seen about 200,000 students since we started this program 12 years ago. And we've now pivoted that program and are delivering some of the same concepts online, because we can't have the kids coming into the building right now. So I mentioned that our mission is to pioneer collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And I imagine some of you were probably picking up, well, hey, you know, I was talking a lot about our work in the Gulf of Maine, with people in the Gulf of Maine, with kids here in Maine. So how are we actually addressing global ocean challenges? And right, we have this dissonance between our mission and between our work, and in some ways the name of the institute. But one of the lessons that I think we have is that the Gulf of Maine is a really unique place. And now we have the fact that the Gulf of Maine is changing quickly. So this is the sea surface temperature record from the Gulf of Maine, started in 1981. This is data that comes mostly from satellites. And you can see just, you know, a lot of noise year to year. And in particular, through about the year, say 2010 or so, mostly our temperature is just bouncing around. But since 2010, we've really jumped and gotten quite a bit warmer. And this long-term trend, the blue line there, that's about 4 times the global ocean average over that period. which means that we're one of the fastest warming regions of the ocean. So the statistic that we've pulled out of the data is that we have been warming faster than 99% of the global ocean. So we really are this unique part of the world. And that gets back to our mission. The idea is that if we can learn how to manage our resources, how to predict changes, how to help people make decisions against this really strong trend, that's knowledge that can help people beyond fisheries and beyond the Gulf of Maine. That's the hope. And just a little bit of news. So the yellow star is where we are this year. This year is also one of our really warm years. We're actually right on trend. Which is kind of interesting. It started as a fairly cool, it actually started warm, then it was cool in the spring, and then we warmed up really fast at the early part of the summer and have stayed really warm even now into the fall. Even as we've started to cool off a little bit, the water can hold on to a lot of heat. And so the Gulf of Maine is still quite a bit warmer than average. So I want to shift now and think about, well, what does this mean, right? What are we learning in the Gulf of Maine that matters? And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to ground this in some outcomes from the 4th National Climate Assessment. So the National Climate Assessment is it's a federally mandated process where an organization called the U.S. Global Change Research Program is supposed to produce a review of how climate change has and will impact the United States and the people and the resources that we care about here in the country. And they're supposed to deliver that to Congress. This was the first time, the 4th Climate Assessment was the first time they actually met their 4-year deadline. It usually seems to take a little bit longer, but it is a really unique opportunity, and it's something really unique that the United States does. So I was asked to lead one of the chapters. So I had the privilege of leading the Oceans and Marine Resources chapter. So some of the chapters are very regional. So there's a chapter on the Northeast that covers the part of the country from North Carolina to Maine. And within that region looks at different, at all of the different sectors within that region from a regional point of view. We also have these what are called sector chapters, and the oceans is one of them, where we look at more of a national perspective from the point of view of the sector. So we were reviewing the literature and trying to come up with what are the really interesting and important things that the people of the United States need to understand right now about how climate change has and will impact the ocean, and do it in a way that's relevant to people from Hawaii to the Caribbean to Alaska to Maine. So we were asked to come up with 3 key messages. And so I'm going to structure most of my talk here around these 3 key messages. So the first one we came up with is that the oceans are experiencing extreme events. Mostly these are going to be heat related, but also we're starting to see some extreme events that are related to oxygen and also to ocean acidification. And the Gulf of Maine is one of the places that has been at the forefront of experiencing these extreme events. And the neat thing about them is that it's not just that they're really warm, but they actually show us how the system works, and they show us how people can respond to big changes in the world. So in 2012, we had a major heat wave. It was actually one of the first ocean heat waves that was ever described. It went from Cape Hatteras to Iceland, and the Gulf of Maine was right at the epicenter of that event. So big year, lots of big things going on. Lobster got a lot of attention in 2012. Lobster landings were really high, but more importantly, they were really early. And early is a challenge because the supply chain wasn't ready for all of these lobster to come ashore all at once. And so the price collapsed, and it ended up being a really challenging year for a lot of people in the industry. Puffins are also a species in our region that seems to be very sensitive to these heat waves. Not so much the puffins themselves. The temperature doesn't bother them. They can actually stand temperatures quite a bit warmer than what they're experiencing. But we see changes in their prey. So they nest on particular islands, especially in the islands down east, and the mommies and daddy puffins go out and forage from those islands, and they try to catch small silvery fish, herring, hake, things like that. During our heat wave years, we often get a number of southerly species that move in, and in particular, we get a species of fish called butterfish, which sounds delicious, and mommy and daddy puffins think it's delicious, but butterfish are really wide. And if the chicks aren't big enough, when the butterfish come in, they actually can't swallow it. And so they've had a number of years where the chick hatching, or the success of the chicks was really impacted because of the change in the fish off of the islands. But people are also impacted by these events. And one of the interesting things that people do is that we change our behavior. So following the 2012 event, the lobster industry in Maine got together and said, this is really tough. We really want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So they put a lot of effort into developing markets, new markets for their product, especially for the soft shell lobster that we tend to get in the summer, and we tend to get during these early and hot heat wave years. And we did some analysis a few years ago that showed that in 2016, when we had another heat wave that was very similar to the one we experienced in 2012, that the lobster industry was actually able to hold on to a lot more value. And so it was a sign that the industry had been able to make some adaptations to the changes in the water. So event, impact, and then change, adaptation. So one of the other key messages that we wanted to talk about were fisheries. And that's because fisheries are an important economic driver for how people relate to the ocean, especially in the United States. But it's also a place where we're seeing a lot of really interesting energy, and where there's some real developments for how we're starting to manage fisheries in light of climate change. So fisheries are really important in Maine. There's no fishery in Maine that's more important than the lobster fishery. It's the most valuable fishery in the United States, and together with Canada, it's the most valuable fishery in the world, the fishery for American lobster. And lobster management in Maine is really fascinating. And it's fascinating because it was developed basically by the lobstermen themselves. And the strategy is to nurture the population of lobsters so that they can make a lot more baby lobsters. So one of the things that Maine does that has been unique, other places have started to do this as well, but Maine has had, for a long time, had an upper size limit. So everybody has agreed that you shouldn't land the really small lobsters, so they go back over the side. But Maine is the only place, or has been the only place for a long time, that discards the really large lobsters. And the idea is that those are the ones that are going to be really potent reproducers, and are going to be able to produce a lot of eggs. We also, and here's a quote by Steve Train, who's a lobsterman in Casco Bay from Long Island, that I'm gonna have to move my Zoom, that says the small lobster, the one at the top of the screen, was 1.25 pounds, normal size lobster. The big one was over 7 pounds and too big to keep, so we let her breed for the future. #sustainable fishing, #lobster from Maine. So this is something that the Maine lobster industry has a lot of pride in. We also do something called V-notching, where when a lobsterman catches a lobster that has eggs carried on its abdomen, they'll cut a little notch, which you can see on the lower part of the screen on one of the tail flippers, and that will stay through several molts, so for several years, and you're not allowed to land a lobster with a V-notch. So it basically says this is a lobster that knows how to breed successfully in the ocean, so we're going to give her a couple more chances to do that before she ends up on somebody's plate. But we also have environmental changes that have, and so both of these things, the maximum size and the V-notching, are a big part, we think, for why lobster have been doing so well in Maine. But we've also had some interesting environmental trends. So temperature, as I said, the Gulf of Maine has been warming. Lobster are sensitive to temperature, but there's a question about whether they're at the optimum here in the Gulf of Maine. So my colleague Arno Labris and I put together a computer model that tried to take all of the different ways that we think temperature can impact lobsters. And we tried to make one model be able to reproduce the patterns that we've seen in the Gulf of Maine, so in the northern part of the range, and in southern New England, which is the southern part of the range, so Rhode Island. And so you can see here the gray dots are the observations of how many lobsters there have been. So Maine, it's been increasing. Southern New England, they peaked in the late 1990s, and then it's declined to the point where the inshore fishery in Rhode Island is effectively closed. And so we asked our computer model, could it reproduce these patterns? So starting from 1985, and one of the neat things you can do in a computer is you can sort of pull apart the different effects. So he said, what if we just, in each of these regions, kept temperature constant? And you see that in Maine, the constant temperature, we get a little bit of an increase, and that's because the temperature we used was close to the temperature in like 1995. So it actually is a little bit of warming. And in Southern New England, you get the peak and then you get a decline, but not as steep as decline of what we actually observed. If we use the actual temperature, we get much closer to what we actually observed. And in Southern New England, if we add an additional level of mortality due to shell disease, which is something that they're seeing in Southern New England in their really warm conditions, we can get the blue line down around the gray dots. But then the other thing we can do is we can actually play a game and say, well, what if Maine had managed its fishery like Southern New England, where we weren't V-notching and where we weren't throwing away throwing over the older, larger lobsters, and also what if Southern New England had Maine's management? What you see is that the effect is almost the same as temperature. So in Maine, the increase that we've seen is essentially we have these two factors that have added together to build some resilience in this fishery. So temperature has been really good for us, but the management that we have for lobsters has allowed us to maximize that management. And the flip side is that in Southern New England, if they had been protecting their lobsters the way that Maine had been protecting them, they would have held on to their fishery, we think. But what about the future? So we can take our computer models and say, well, what happens as the temperature warms up? And we ran our models out through the year 2050, so middle of the century. And we see that there's a range of outcomes depending on whether we're at whether we get a little bit of warming or a lot of warming. If we get a lot of warming, we expect that the landings in Maine are going to decline. But the really interesting thing is that at 2050, even under the hot scenario, that the number of lobsters is still similar to what we had in the 1990s. Maine was still a lobster state in the 1990s. We still had lobster on the license plate. So we can hold on to this fishery if we manage it successfully. But what about after 2050? So after 2050, things depend on the rest of us. So up to 2050 depends on the lobstermen and the people who are regulating the fishery. Beyond 2050, it depends on the decisions that we and the rest of humanity make around carbon. So the blue curve is the temperature if we implement something close to the Paris climate goals, actually a little bit more aggressive than that, and stabilize global temperatures. The red is if we blow through that on the business as usual scenario, which is the one that the United States is on right now. And if we stabilize the climate, then the southern coast of Maine by 2050 may in certain years start to feel like Rhode Island, and it has already during some of our heat wave years. And those years, we actually see the lobsters start to get a little stressed in the southern part of the state. But down east, things have been really good. But in this business as usual high CO2 scenario, by the end of the century, Maine could actually lose the lobster fishery if Rhode Island if down east starts to have temperatures close to Rhode Island, Maine will no longer be a lobster state. So then the last key message that we had was around ecosystem disruption. And when we put this together, we really were thinking about coral reefs because they are so strongly impacted by climate change, by warming, and we think in the future by ocean acidification. And so we really wanted to lead that. And we had a great co-author who's a coral reef ecologist. And if you ever want to get bummed out, go follow coral reef ecologists on Twitter, especially the ones from Australia. It's a really challenging time for coral reefs, and it's really emotionally hard for the people who have spent their lives studying these ecosystems. But ecosystem disruptions are also happening in other places in the ocean, and that was part of the message. So the Gulf of Maine ecosystem is a classic North Atlantic ecosystem. And this blue area is what we define as the North Atlantic biome. So you can see that the Gulf of Maine is actually one of the warmer or one of the southerly parts of this classic North Atlantic ecosystem. What does it take to be a classic North Atlantic ecosystem? Well, you need a spring bloom, so an intense pulse of phytoplankton that happens in the spring. That's the productivity that fuels these ecosystems. You also have to have something called calanus, which is a copepod, a tiny, about the size of a grain of rice crustacean that is the conduit that gets that productivity from the single-celled phytoplankton up to things like fish and whales. And we actually define this blue area, the biome of the North Atlantic, as the location where basically any ecosystem that can support calanus in high abundance. That's what we think should be used to define the ecosystem. Many of these ecosystems also have herring. A few of them have some other small silvery fish, but herring are another classic North Atlantic species. They're very important in the Gulf of Maine. They're important as a food source for cod and humpback whales and bluefin tuna and some of the larger species that we have in this region. Cod are also a classic North Atlantic species, and all of these places from the Gulf of Maine to the Grand Banks to the North Sea to the Barents Sea and north of Norway all have or have had really important cod fisheries. And although we don't think of it, all of these ecosystems have had right whales in the past, and they're a classic North Atlantic species as well, and they feed directly on calanus. So right whales were extirpated from the eastern part of the North Atlantic. They were pretty much gone by about 1400. No, a little later than that, 1500. And then the fishery moved to North America after the Europeans started colonizing America. Right whales were seriously reduced in abundance in our region to the point where there probably were only a couple hundred left in the early 80s. They've rebounded a bit to get up to about 420 whales. That was maybe 5 years ago. And then now they've started to decline as well, in part due to some of the climate stress that we're seeing in this region. So one way of thinking about what ecosystem disruption looks like in this region, it's not going to be as serious as like coral reefs, where really you're just totally doing a complete change in what the ecosystem looks like. Here, things will sort of look in many ways the same, but we were just going to change the cast of characters. So in 1985, the Gulf of Maine had lobster. It had a lot of cod, not as many cod as it had 50 years before that, but it had a lot of cod. It had a lot of calanus, probably as many calanus as we've ever had in the Gulf of Maine. Herring were really low in abundance, and that's mostly because they'd been seriously overfished during the 1970s, and so mid-80s was when they were finally starting to rebound a little bit. And then we had a few right whales in the Gulf of Maine, and of course we have puffins. Puffins actually have increased in 2015 due to restoration. Right whales have increased due to improved management and some things that people were doing, like reducing ship speeds and changing some of the fishing practices, like going to some seasonal closures in places like Cape Cod Bay. They're important right whale habitats. Herring have rebounded due to improved fishery management. Calanus is a little lower in 2015 than it was in 1985, but there's still some. Cod are really low. That's in part due to warming waters and also due to some management challenges, in part because the management couldn't keep up with the pace of warming. And so that allowed overfishing that has reduced cod to their lowest level ever in the Gulf of Maine. On the flip side, lobster are doing great, right? We have a lot of lobster. And then we also have a few species like black sea bass and like squid that are starting to come into the Gulf of Maine, especially during some of the really warm years that we've had. And then moving to the future, that's where we're really going to start to see this disruption. And many of these things we can already see. We're already seeing signs that calanus is declining in the Gulf of Maine. We're seeing signs that herring are declining in the Gulf of Maine, or at least not reproducing as well as they used to. Cod, while we think they can rebound and be more prominent than they are right now, as the ecosystem continues to warm, it's going to be increasingly stressful for cod. Lobster, I already told you the lobster story. Right whales, we expect, are going to start to spend less time in the Gulf of Maine and more time in other habitats. And then by the middle of the century, we also expect to see more of these southerly species start to become established in this region. In fact, Wells was the plankton survey that Wells does is the first one in Maine to actually catch a larvae, essentially a baby black sea bass, which is a really interesting observation that suggests that it's not just that adults are coming in during the warm years, but they're actually starting to get established here and having some success reproducing in Maine. So these are our three key messages. But one of the ways that we tried to wrap up our chapter, and what was really interesting was when I got to see all of the other chapters together, we all had a very similar take on the situation with climate in the United States, and that's. So the United States, we had valuable ecosystems. So we really were trying to emphasize the value to the nation of marine ecosystems, and other chapters were talking about the value of agriculture or forestry or transportation sector. And that they're at risk of being disrupted by by changes in temperature, by losing habitat, and by changing the structure of the food web. We think this ecosystem disruption is going to intensify. This is consistent with the climate model. So more warming, more acidification, deoxygenation is a growing challenge that the oceanographic community is starting to think more about. And then in the absence, while there are things that we can do a good job managing our fisheries. We can start to think about adapting some of our industries, but there are some limits to how much we can adapt. And in the absence of significant reductions in carbon emissions, these transformative impacts are going to continue, and some of them can't be avoided. And corals are a little bit in that camp. So the question is, okay, how can we adapt, and how can we reduce some of these emissions? And that's where Maine is, I think, doing a really remarkable job. So when Governor Mills was elected, one of the first things that she and the new legislature did was to pass a bill authorizing the creation of something called the Maine Climate Council. So it was created in 2019 with two goals: to reduce the state's carbon emissions and to build resilience in Maine's economy to climate impacts. So we're going to reduce emissions with the goal of by 2030 of getting to 45% below 1990 levels, which would be these are really ambitious goals. By 2050, we're going to be 80% below 1990s levels, which is not quite what scientists say you need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, but it's pretty close. If everybody was doing what Maine is planning to do, the world would be in much better shape. But then the governor added an additional goal, and that's we're going to be, not only are we going to reduce our emissions, but we're going to be net zero by 2045. And so that means is we're going to reduce the amount of carbon we're going to put in the atmosphere, and we're also going to increase and start to keep track of how much carbon is stored in things like Maine's forests. Because there's a lot that Maine can do. We have a lot of land, we have a lot of forested land, and if we're really good at managing that, that can actually pull some additional CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then we're going to focus on building resilience in Maine's communities, people, and industries. And Maine is putting a big premium on trying to do this in a way that is equitable and that is going to be maximize the economic benefits that we have from some of these big transformations that we need to do to our economy. So we're going to prioritize the welfare of Maine citizens. We're going to foster the state's natural resources and natural resource industries, and we're going to encourage diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so that's been a big part of what the Climate Council has been trying to do. So a few other things about the Climate Council. It's science-based. So part of that, I'm on the Climate Council. I'm also on the Science and Technical Committee, so that the whole process started with a scientific review, almost like a mini national climate assessment, but for Maine, to try to figure out where are we now and where could we reasonably go. They did a rigorous cost-benefit analysis of some of the recommendations that came out of the working groups. It's inclusive. We have several working groups, and each of them has representatives from state government, from science, from the legislature, from the NGO community, and from the business community. Because we really want to make sure that the recommendations have buy-in and are likely to be successful. Some of the examples, this is not an exhaustive list, but there were working groups that were dealing with transportation, with energy and industry, with health. Health has been a really interesting one to think about, especially in the COVID situation. Natural and working lands, and then coasts and marine ecosystems. There's been public outreach. There have been a series of public meetings. It's much like this. They've had to shift to Zoom, unfortunately, but they have had public meetings, and they are open for public feedback. So if you want to see more about what the Climate Council is up to, you can go to the climatecouncilmaine.gov link at the bottom and learn more about what they're doing. There's some additional opportunities to get feedback. And there's some contact information as well if you feel like you want to make a recommendation or a suggestion. And the other thing is that it's urgent. So the council was launched in September of 2019. We have basically 2 more months to develop our final recommendation. So we have some candidate recommendations that the council put together and talked about a couple of weeks ago. We're now revising those and trying to really figure out what are the recommendations that are going to meet the goals of reducing emissions and building resilience. So I want to just conclude with this slide because I think it captures a little bit of not only where we are in the Gulf of Maine, and that the Gulf of Maine is this really important, precious ecosystem, but it's also changing rapidly, and it's a microcosm for the changes that we're seeing all throughout the world's oceans, and frankly beyond the ocean as well. And so while we pulled these ideas together specifically for the marine environment, many of them I think you could translate and talk about if you want to talk about forestry or agriculture or human health as well. So I would love to take some questions and have a discussion, and I'm happy to go anywhere you want to go around climate and the Gulf of Maine.
Thanks, Andy. So just a reminder to folks to type your questions in the chat box. Whoops, thought I lost you there for a second. So just type your questions in the chat box and Andy will address them.
And we're probably a small enough group too that if somebody just waves their hand, I bet we could unmute and talk.
Yep, that's true too. Although I can't see most of you. So you can unmute yourself. Okay, here's a question from Lisa. Any thoughts as to why the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than other oceans?
So this is a trick that I've told my my students and colleagues, that you always prepare a talk and leave something out so that you know what the first question is going to be. So I didn't tell you why the Gulf of Maine is warming faster because I knew someone would ask it. So the Gulf of Maine lies at a really interesting part, a really important part of the corner of the ocean where we have essentially a boundary between real cold water that comes to us via Canada that has some Arctic flavor as well. And we have warm water that comes up from the south that has a little bit of a Gulf Stream flavor. So you can think of it as warm, salty water and relatively cold, fresh water. So that means the Gulf of Maine is a little bit like a bathtub. So if you turn the cold tap down and you turn the warm tap up, your bath is going to warm up. And that's what's been happening in the Gulf of Maine. So we've had less of the cold water coming in, and we've had more warm water that's penetrated into the Gulf of Maine. And on top of that, we've also had a warmer atmosphere. So like this summer was a really warm summer, a lot of clear days. And so that's a great condition for warming up the ocean. So then it begs the question, okay, well, why have we seen these big changes in the oceanography, right? The differences in the sources. And that's also a global warming story. So as the North Atlantic warms up, we're seeing more melting in places like Greenland and more export of fresh water out of the Arctic into the North Atlantic. freshwater is light. It wants to sit on top of the surface of the ocean. And so that ends up disrupting the whole circulation of the North Atlantic. And it causes us to get that warm water punch. And it also causes in some ways, our sister ecosystem, which is the Barents Sea, the area north of Norway, also gets warm water penetrating up there. And so our two ecosystems are essentially warming in parallel at fairly similar rates.
I have a question for Andy.
Yep.
Andy, so this is a very simple question. If climatologically we are similar to Rhode Island, let's say, and in the near future, and really that is the near future, you had mentioned that at least we were doing a good job managing lobsters, so that we're gonna be doing okay. But how about for other species that occur in the Gulf of Maine? What's their destiny if we are Rhode Island in 25, 40 years?
So the simplest way to think about ecosystem changes in the ocean is that you just kind of think about the critters that live in one place and imagine them just moving across the map. And they're not literally like moving necessarily. Some of them do. Some of the larger ones actually will just track the temperatures. But so like for lobster, it's not that the Rhode Island lobsters have migrated to Maine. It's that Maine has become more productive. And so we've produced more lobsters, and Rhode Island has become less productive. So they've produced fewer. So if you think about Rhode Island, the classic species that you associate with Rhode Island are some of the larger reef fish like tautog and cunner, a little bit of black sea bass. And those are species that we're starting to see more and more in the Gulf of Maine, all the way up pretty much to Casco Bay is, in the mid-coast area, is really a boundary region. But black sea bass have been just steadily marching north. They're now really solidly established in Massachusetts Bay, and we now see some signs that they're getting more established here. We also have had blue crabs and some of the other crab species, some of the warmer crab species coming in. Blue crabs there's now starting to catch them quite a bit more regularly, and off of the Plum Island research area off of Gloucester, kind of in that part of the northern northern part of Massachusetts. So that's kind of the picture that you have. But one of the big research questions that we're trying to tackle is, can all of these species keep up together? Or are you seeing, I think of it as almost like shearing in the ecosystem, where the ecosystem is starting to pull apart. So some species are doing okay, other species are not. And you don't get necessarily these same ecosystems. And there is some sign of that there's some theory that backs that up, and there might be some places where we're seeing that in the ocean as well. From your I appreciated that you asked the management question, because we have a lot of control over, especially the larger species in the system. So we talked about lobster, cod, haddock, herring, all of these commercial fisheries. We make decisions every year that determine how many fish will get caught. That decision-making process, the U.S. does this better than anybody in the world, but we designed a system that assumes that you have an ecosystem that just has this mean state and that has variability around the mean. That the system that we created didn't anticipate a trend. And so that's a big part of the research that we're doing at GMRI, is trying to figure out how you can actually sustainably manage these fishery resources against a trend. And it's a tough problem. And then the other species, the species where you'd say that management is really failing right now, is right whales. So last summer and several summers before that, we had a number of right whales that got tangled up in lobster and crab gear. They get mixed up in the lines, and showed up dead. A number of ship strikes, especially in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there's a big debate now whether Maine, and in particular the Maine lobster fishery, bears any responsibility for that and needs to take any action to protect that species. So there's a major lawsuit that's underway right now. At the same time, we do know that the whales are spending more time in Canada, and the Canadians are playing catch up to try to get some regulations in place that will protect the whales. They've moved, I would say, faster than I expected that they could, but you know, the number of deaths that they've had in their waters the last few years suggests that they're not quite there.
Thank you.
Another question in the chat box here from Katrina. Thank you for your work on the Climate Council. What are the perceived roadblocks to actually realizing the recommendations coming from your subcommittee? Is it political or regulatory, lack of data, lack of funds, etc.?
Great question. So as with anything in state government, this is the first time I've really gotten to work deeply with state government, so it's been fascinating. It's both a combination of political and funding are the two big hurdles that we are going to have to wrestle with over the next 2 months. So one of the things I've been tracking really closely is transportation. So Maine has done a great job. We're part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a multi-state compact that has gradually been reducing emissions from our energy sector, from industry and energy. It's a really unique system. It's been hugely successful, and it does two things. It puts a price on putting carbon into the atmosphere, and so a business has to actually, or an industry actually has to pay for a permit to put carbon in the atmosphere, and that's an auction. So, and over time it gets more expensive, and that money comes back to the states that participate, and it's what funds Efficiency Maine, which has done again a really remarkable job at using that money to help Mainers do things like install heat pumps, improve the efficiency of their homes, and so it's reducing our energy emissions that way. So the next big thing that Maine has to deal with, and it would be the same for any other state, is transportation. The next major source of emissions is from our cars and from driving around the state. And Maine is a rural state. We have a lot of vehicle miles, even though we don't have a lot of population. So we know where we have to go. And the working groups are really good at saying, okay, here's how many electric vehicles you have to have on the road in every year in order to meet the governor's goals and to reduce the emissions. And they proposed, all right, well, maybe a couple $1,000 credit to make it easier to buy electric vehicles and incentivize that. So that's probably a politically palatable thing to do, but we don't know where to get the money from. And we're in the middle of an economic crisis. So that's going to be a tough thing to do. The other thing is that I worry that it's not necessarily going to move fast enough. We don't know whether just having a couple $1,000 incentive is going to actually incentivize people to buy electric cars fast enough to make a difference. So there is a multi-state compact that's being discussed, similar to the RGGI model, that would apply to transportation, that would basically impose a fee for onto the oil companies for essentially bringing oil into, gasoline or diesel into our region, and then they would presumably transmit that cost on to us as consumers. That would generate money that then the states could use to do things like subsidize electric vehicles or set up electric vehicle charging stations. So I've been really, it's been fascinating to see how people react to that idea. It's getting beaten up a little bit by both the people, political concerns, because nobody wants to be the one that raises gas prices, even though we're all freeloading on the atmosphere a little bit right now. But you also, the other challenge is that the way the TCI was developed, it wasn't perceived as being an inclusive process. And so people feel left out. And that's become such an important part of the lens that which we're processing a lot of environmental challenges, especially this summer, that diversity, equity, inclusion lens that TCI is getting kind of beaten up from that side as well. So that's, I think, one of the big challenges that I see coming is how are we going to get the resources to incentivize some of the adaptation and some of the emissions reductions, and and then how are we going to take on perhaps some of these politically unpalatable ideas?
Don't see any other questions yet. I'm wondering, Andy, how do you keep your hopes up when you're studying this, Gulf of Maine warming faster than anywhere else? What?
Yeah, I look at my colleagues who study coral reefs, and no, I shouldn't joke about that because I actually get really I get really emotional. You can see my background. I really like coral, and I don't. I find that very very troubling. It's a growing challenge. We actually had our science team at GMRI. We do a regular, every couple of weeks we'll get together and read and discuss a paper. And this summer, one of the junior scientists proposed, look, let's read this paper about essentially climate stress. And the paper was advocating that people who are studying and are involved in climate change research should really consider support, and that institutions that are doing that kind of work should really think about the emotional support for the people who are doing that work. It can be really challenging. I have to say the energy in the state, the fact that Maine, right, little Maine, right, our little state, 1.5 million people in the corner of the country, like decided to take climate change seriously and is trying to do something bigger and bolder that even California and New York haven't done yet. That gives me some hope, right? If we can do it, anybody should be able to do it. And I think if Maine can figure it out, it will, we're a purple state. If we can figure it out, that will hopefully spread throughout the country.
Any other questions from the group? Again, you can type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and just ask.
I wanted to say that I loved the purple state statement. That's so great. I haven't heard that before.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's
really wonderful.
Yeah, I think that it's out there as a way of describing states like Maine that have a little bit of Democrat, a little bit of Republican, and are kind of right on that, right on that that boundary sometimes. And I think what's interesting about Maine is that I do feel like we do really live with those two realities, and I think there's a little bit more respect in the state for at least I hope that for opposite people in opposite in those opposite camps.
Oh, thanks, Nancy. Nancy saying no specific questions, but I appreciate this series and thank you for this talk.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was fun to see people on a Tuesday night.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate that. And if you're interested in more, the wellsreserve.org, or rather wellsreserve.org, has all the details about future programs. Oh, is this another question? Yes. Suzanne Williams, on a positive note, what value do the potential blue crab and black sea bass fisheries add to our economy, and are we poised to capture those?
Yeah, so great question. Those are both really valuable species. Black sea bass actually, pound for pound, is as valuable as lobster. It's not clear whether you would ever be able to have as many black sea bass along the coast of Maine as we have lobsters, but it's potentially a really valuable species. There's some management challenges, both for our fishermen to get access to things like black sea bass requires some changes to the regulations. Because we've never fished for black sea bass, our fishermen don't have access to them. So that will require some negotiation. And then it also will require some, I think, better science to figure out exactly how many and how quickly they're reproducing, because that determines how many you can fish sustainably in the system. Because you don't want to overfish them before they get established, because they're trying to make a living in the ocean as it warms. So that's certainly there is certainly some optimism there that we can that Maine can get some value. Globally, it's easy to think about like fisheries just kind of moving across the map, and that one state's fishery just becomes the next state to the north. There are a couple of places where that breaks down. One is in the tropics, because there's nothing to come in, right? If you're already warm, if you're already the warmest place and it gets even warmer, there's not that species waiting to come in. And tropical fisheries are really important for many of the small island nations, both from a food security point of view and from an economic point of view. So that's more of a global challenge. And then in the Arctic, you do have some species that are adapted specifically to the ice. And if you lose the ice, then those species get really stressed. So, I mean, polar bears is sort of the obvious one that we think about, but there's some fish species as well that that really depend on the presence of ice.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for sharing your knowledge with us, and to all of you for joining tonight on this first day of autumn, right?
Yeah, you're welcome. So thanks. It was really fun, and good luck to everybody out there.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Susan.
Bye-bye.
It was really fun.